History holds many secrets, but some mysteries challenge everything we know about the past. One such mystery lies hidden in the heart of the 19th century. The goal of our investigation is to understand what happened in the first half of the 19th century, what its consequences were, and why finding any clear information about it is so difficult. Broadly speaking, what occurred can be called a catastrophe. Whether it was natural or man-made isn't the most important question right now. What matters is that it changed the climate, the landscape, and the very way people lived. From the middle of the century onward, the world was a different place. Fortunately, more and more independent research on this topic has been appearing recently. The term buried cities has become commonplace and no longer needs detailed explanation. Many researchers attempting to date these events converge on a single approximate time, the 1840s. This is likely both true and untrue. The catastrophic impacts weren't a single event. The soil that covered the land fell unevenly. Some areas suffered more, others less, and some, you might say, got lucky. If, of course, you can call it luck to survive and witness the fall of a highly advanced civilization, only to then begin building the world we now live in on its ruins, using harsh and brutal methods. We are primarily interested in the traces this alleged catastrophe left on the territory of the Russian Empire, within its borders at that time. Unfortunately, there's every reason to believe this territory was among the most severely affected. Imagine if tens or even hundreds of trillions of tons of what is now under our feet, sand, clay, and other soil, were thrown into the atmosphere. As these masses gradually fell, carried by the winds, they would have accumulated mainly in the continental interiors. To understand this, let's consider a simple example. Imagine someone drilling a well by hand. On top there's a layer of yellow clay, say 17 meters thick. Below that, 11 meters of gray clay. Deeper still, down to 44 meters, is bright red clay. And then comes the sand. First fine, then coarse. If you were to lift all this into the air and let it settle, what would fall first? The sand, of course, being the heaviest fraction, would fall in that exact order. And while we can't be certain, modern data suggests that if a satellite were to break apart in Earth's orbit, God forbid, there is more than enough of this material up there. We will discuss the causes and nature of the 19th century catastrophe later. For now, let's accept one simple fact. Speaking, and especially writing about it, was apparently strictly forbidden. And when there are no official sources, one must turn to indirect ones. Such sources can be any texts from that time, like the works of writers. Many might argue that fiction is just the author's imagination. But think about it. If you ask modern science fiction writers to describe life on Mars, most of them will still describe earthly realities. Their characters, even in fictional settings, will eat organic food, go to work, and experience very human emotions. In essence, they would be describing their own lives, not the lives of Martians. Very few would reach the brilliant imagination of Stanislaw Lem, with his sentient ocean on the planet Solaris. If we turn to the literature of the past, we find even more reflections of reality. That is why, when official documents are silent or have been destroyed, the truth should be sought where no one would think to hide it, in the pages of fiction. Like a mirror, literature reflects not just plots, but the very atmosphere of an era, its daily life, its landscapes, and its unspoken tragedies. And in this search for circumstantial evidence, our main and most unexpected witness takes the stage. Nikolai Vasilievich Gogol. He is the ideal candidate precisely because he was never considered a writer of fantasy. On the contrary, Gogol firmly established realism in Russian literature, continuing the work started by Pushkin. We need the most realistic description possible of the period that interests us. the first half of the 19th century. And no one has ever doubted Gogol's truthfulness. Even Emperor Nicholas I, a stern and powerful monarch, not only approved, but personally supported the staging of the scandalous play The Government Inspector. Without his backing, the censors would never have allowed the play to be produced, let alone published. Historians write that after watching the comedy, Nicholas I laughed heartily and said the now famous words, "What a play! Everyone gets a beating, and I most of all." Afterward, he sent the 27-year-old author a generous gift of money. Moreover, according to biographers, the emperor sent Gogol similar gifts on multiple occasions. This fact is worth remembering. Here we must preemptively answer the arrogant claims of those who say history cannot be studied through fiction. The answer is simple. History must be studied using all available materials. Does anyone seriously believe that Gogol wrote for his own amusement, and that Emperor Nicholas I so highly valued his harmless humor? Our time is rightly called the Information Age, but in the past, information was also expensive and strictly controlled. The circulation of magazines in the 19th century rarely exceeded 1,000 copies. It's very likely that without the financial support of Nicholas I, we wouldn't even know of the writer Gogol today. To those who dismiss fiction as a historical source, one can ask a simple question. Show us another source. If there isn't one, then we must use what we have. It is not our task to judge the artistic merits of Gogol's works. Let's assume that The Government Inspector is indeed a very funny play, and let's agree that everything he wrote is exceptionally truthful. These texts faced no objections from pre-revolutionary or Soviet censors, and today they are part of the school curriculum. We are not here to attack the classics. We are here to extract information from them about the matter that concerns us, the catastrophe of the 19th century and its aftermath. Gogol's magnum opus is, without a doubt, the poem Dead Souls. Most people are familiar with its plot from their school days, and the plot itself won't be our main focus. But it's worth recalling that the main character, Chichikov, arrives in a provincial town and starts buying up deceased serfs who are, on paper, still listed as alive. The landowners who owned these serfs hadn't yet gotten around to reporting their deaths. We're not interested in the scam itself, but in the worlds that made it possible. Gogol's most famous work is seen as a biting satire on officials and landowners. But what if we look beyond the plot, at the backdrop against which it unfolds? What terrifying truth about his era did the writer unwittingly document while creating his immortal work? It is in Dead Souls that we find the key, the main clue in our investigation. The plot, as we remember, centers on Chichikov buying up serfs who have died, but are still legally alive on paper. But what's far more interesting is why he needed these souls. Gogol reveals this at the very end of the first volume. Chichikov's plan was to acquire 1,000 souls and mortgage them to a government board of trustees for 200 rubles apiece. This would net him an enormous sum for the time, 200,000 rubles, without owning any actual property. He needed this money for resettlement, as the author calls it. This resettlement was to the Kherson and Taurida provinces, where land was being given away for free to new settlers. That's all you need to know about the plot. But behind this simple con lies a shocking reality. Let's really think about what Gogol describes. The Board of Trustees was a state institution that, among other things, gave out loans, and it was willing to pay huge sums of money to resettle people in the Kherson and Taurida provinces. Were these lands empty before? The book, remember, was written in the late 1830s and early 1840s. The Kherson province at that time included modern-day Odessa, Mykolaiv, and parts of the Dnipropetrovsk and Kirovohrad regions. The Taurida province included not only Crimea but also a large part of the northern Azov coast and the modern Kherson region south of the Dnieper River. These are gigantic, incredibly fertile territories, the jewel of the empire, its southern frontier. The total area is over 100,000 square kilometers. That's about the size of 3 Moscow or Tula regions combined. And the state was sponsoring the settlement of these lands. Not the remote Urals, not Siberia, but the entire Black Sea and Azov coasts had suddenly become empty. That's the first part of the puzzle. The second, just as important, is where did such a huge number of dead souls come from? The system was designed so that landowners should have been rushing to report deceased serfs, because every living soul on the census rolls meant paying taxes. Yet, the book describes landowners who are unbelievably stingy, people who would save an old boot sole as if it were a treasure, and suddenly, they stop reporting their population losses en masse. Why? There can be only one answer. The loss of life was so massive and so sudden that the system simply collapsed. Something happened that caused a huge number of people to vanish and entire regions to become desolate. In outlining his hero's scam, Gogol also points to the reasons for this state of affairs. Chichikov seeks out corners of the country that suffered more than others from unfortunate accidents, crop failures, and the like. This implies that all regions suffered, but some suffered especially. Is there any other way to interpret these words? A demographic abyss had opened up, and the government was desperately trying to fill it by encouraging resettlement. Of course, historians have an official explanation: the cholera epidemic of 1830 through 1831. It is said that this was the cause of such a sharp population decline. But perhaps cholera was a cover for another, far more terrible disaster that made living in these areas impossible. We can't make that claim without checking the facts. So let's see if the official version holds up to a basic numbers check. Or is it just a convenient excuse for something that was ordered to be forgotten? So the official version on the table is a cholera epidemic. It's a simple and understandable explanation that at first glance seems to answer all the questions. But in any investigation, it's precisely these simple answers that should arouse the most suspicion. Let's examine this version impartially, relying solely on the figures and facts that have survived. An epidemic did happen, and it claimed many lives. According to official records, in the Russian Empire between 1830 and 1831, there were about 466,000 recorded cases of cholera, resulting in nearly 197,000 deaths. A figure of 200,000 people seems enormous, and it was undoubtedly a terrible tragedy for thousands of families. But to understand the scale, these numbers must be compared to the empire's total population at the time, which was roughly 55 million. And here we make our first discovery. A simple calculation shows that the population loss from this dreadful disease was about 0.4%. Of course, the death rate varied by location. There were surely places where, as with one of Gogol's landowners, half a village died. But there is no evidence that territories the size of the modern Moscow region became completely deserted, to the point that emergency state-level measures were needed to resettle them. And we're not talking about some remote wilderness, but about vital trade routes and the southern ports over which the Crimean War would later be fought. But that's not even the most striking part. If we look at demographic tables, such as those found on the website of Moscow State University's History Department, we find a completely paradoxical picture. A document titled Population of Both Sexes in the Empire shows that during those very cholera years, the country's total population didn't decrease at all. It grew steadily. It's as if those 197,000 people never died from the disease. This makes the disappearance of the population from the vast Kherson and Taurida provinces completely inexplicable. One could argue that the table was drawn up by a student with a ruler, simply extending a straight line of growth. But even if these figures are just estimates, they completely dismantle the theory of a demographic catastrophe caused by an epidemic. Furthermore, the very precision of the numbers, counting the sick and the dead down to the last person, is astonishing. This was in an era when reliable data on the total populations simply didn't exist, and censuses were irregular and highly inaccurate. Such accounting-like precision in disaster statistics suggests that these figures might have been less a reflection of reality and more a convenient, officially approved explanation for something on a much larger scale. The official story is falling apart. It doesn't explain the depopulation of entire provinces, the state program for their urgent resettlement, or the strange behavior of landowners who stopped registering the deaths of their serfs. If official history is just a facade hiding the truth, then what do the real demographic data say? Let's try to move beyond the empire's general figures and find population data specifically for the affected provinces, Kherson and Taurida, during the period in question. What we will find, or rather, what we will not find in the archives, is perhaps the most telling piece of evidence in this whole tangled affair. Having debunked the official epidemic theory, we are left with an even deeper mystery. If disease wasn't the cause of the southern provinces becoming empty, what was? The logical next step in any investigation is to find hard data. It should be simple enough to find population statistics for the Kherson and Taurida provinces from the first half of the 19th century, right? The state must have kept records of its subjects. However, this is where we encounter our biggest disappointment, and, simultaneously, our most important discovery. That information simply doesn't exist. Extensive searches in public records, encyclopedias, and reference books yield no results. For example, the famous Brockhaus and Ephron Encyclopedia provides detailed population data for the Kherson province, but only for the year 1900. For the Taurida province, the data is from 1897. But what about earlier, in the 1830s or 1840s? Silence. Even the information compiled by modern online encyclopedias clarifies nothing. We see that the populations of individual cities like Kherson, Odessa, and Sevastopol grew, but that's a drop in the ocean. What was happening in the vast rural areas that made up the bulk of these provinces is unknown. It feels as though someone carefully snipped several decades of demographic statistics for entire regions out of the historical record. And against this backdrop of an information vacuum, we stumble upon an astonishing fact. While data on people is missing, records of livestock numbers have been perfectly preserved. In fact, they are presented in detailed year-by-year tables. For the Taurida province, the number of horses is known starting from 1848. The number of sheep is known all the way back to 1823. People were not afforded such meticulous record-keeping. For the Kherson province, there's at least some data on livestock from 1808 onward. But again, for people, nothing specific. These livestock statistics are not just a historical curiosity. They are a crucial piece of evidence. Let's see what they tell us. In the Taurida province, from 1823 to 1837, there was a massive boom in sheep farming. The number of fine-fleeced sheep increased sixfold, from 112,000 to 685,000. This is colossal growth, and it speaks volumes. First, it shows that economic activity in the region was not just surviving, but thriving. Second, and most importantly, someone had to be there to herd and count all those sheep. Huge flocks can't exist in an empty wasteland. This means people were there, and in significant numbers. So where did they go after 1837? And why did the state stop counting them as carefully as it counted sheep? A completely absurd, almost Gogol-esque picture emerges. The empire meticulously counts its sheep, horses, and other cattle down to the last head. yet it seems to have lost the data for millions of its subjects in its most strategic and fertile regions. This can't be dismissed as simple negligence or accident. It looks like a deliberate policy, a conscious effort to hide information. It's as if a black hole opened up where the people of these lands once lived, a void that was papered over in official reports with anything available, even sheep farming statistics. Such selective amnesia, such a diligent suppression of facts, could not have been the initiative of some minor official or governor. This points to a state-sponsored directive, executed at the highest level. But why? Why would the state need to erase the memory of the population of entire provinces? And what role in this grand operation to conceal the truth was played by our star witness, the writer Nikolai Gogol, who so timely and so generously received monetary gifts directly from the emperor? So, we have a mosaic of inexplicable facts. Depopulated fertile lands in the empire's south. A state program for their urgent resettlement. Bizarre demographic statistics where sheep are counted more carefully than people. And an official epidemic story that falls apart under scrutiny. All these scattered pieces point to one thing. A catastrophe occurred in the first half of the 19th century, with consequences so massive that the state decided to cover them up. And at the very center of this cover-up, we once again find the figure of Nikolai Vasilyevich Gogol. Let's return to his biography. By all accounts, he came from a family of modest means. When he arrived in St. Petersburg, like many young men from the provinces, he was constantly short of money. Literary earnings at the time were highly unreliable, and magazine circulations were tiny. Yet suddenly, this impoverished young man gets the opportunity to go abroad and live there for over a decade. How did he afford it? We already know the answer. It was made possible by regular monetary gifts from Emperor Nicholas I himself. Let's ask a simple question. Did the emperor provide such patronage to every young writer who came to the capital? Of course not. Nicholas I was a pragmatic and stern ruler, not a philanthropist throwing money around for harmless humor. This implies that Gogol was doing something that was extremely important and necessary for the emperor in his capacity as head of state. And here we arrive at a hypothesis that ties all the threads of our investigation together. Gogol was fulfilling a crucial state commission. But what was this commission? Surely not just to write a satire on officials and landowners. That would be too simple, too pointless. The real task was far more complex and subtle. His mission was not to expose society's flaws, but to document a new, terrifying reality. And to do so from an angle that made it seem not frightening at all. He had to describe the world after the catastrophe, but in such a way that no one would ask the most important question. What actually happened? This is precisely the task that Dead Souls brilliantly accomplishes. Gogol doesn't lie. He honestly describes the horrifying aftermath. A huge number of dead souls available for purchase, and deserted lands in the most fertile provinces that the government is willing to give away for free. He documents the symptoms of the catastrophe. But the genius of this information operation was in shifting the focus. Instead of being horrified by the causes of this situation, the reader laughs at Chichikov's scam and the grotesque landowners. Tragedy was turned into farce. The horror of a demographic abyss was replaced by the comedy of a con. Gogol created a literary anesthetic. He allowed society to see the new reality without comprehending its cause. He described a world where people had vanished and the land lay empty. But he did it in a way that made everyone discuss the protagonist's scheme rather than the reasons for the disappearance. It was a brilliant operation to reprogram the consciousness of the educated class. He helped them accept a new reality without asking inconvenient questions, thereby contributing to the historical amnesia we still see today. If this hypothesis is correct, Gogol appears not as a critic of the regime, but as its subtle and effective tool. He was the executor of a brilliantly conceived plan, but any executor, no matter how talented, merely carries out the will of their patron. If the writer was an instrument in this grand operation of memory management, then who was its chief architect? Who was in charge of Project Oblivion and directed the process of erasing the memory of the 19th century catastrophe from the consciousness of an entire nation? All the threads of our investigation lead to a single point, to a single office, and to a single man who held the absolute power to execute a project of this magnitude. The architect of the Great Oblivion, the man who headed the operation to erase the memory of the 19th century catastrophe, could only have been Emperor Nicholas I himself. It was he, and no one else, who possessed the will, the resources, and the authority to rewrite history in real time. Let's look at his reign through the lens of this hypothesis. The era of Nicholas I is remembered as a time of harsh censorship, total control, and bureaucratic order. But what if this order was not an end in itself, but a necessary measure? What if it was a desperate attempt to prevent the empire from collapsing after an unimaginable shock? The decision to forget the catastrophe, if it was made, could only have come from the very top. It was a strategic decision aimed at preventing panic, chaos, and the disintegration of the state. It was the emperor who personally oversaw censorship. His infamous Third Department of His Imperial Majesty's own chancellery infiltrated every sphere of life. But this control wasn't just suppressive, it was formative. It didn't just ban the undesirable, it promoted the necessary. The fact that Gogol's works, which were caustic and seemingly subversive, not only passed through the censors but did so on the emperor's personal orders, ceases to be a historical paradox. It becomes key evidence. Nicholas I didn't just allow Gogol to write, he guided him. He financed the writer to carry out a delicate task. Consider another aspect of his reign. It was an era of grandiose construction and the imposition of order. But what if this order was being built not on a clean slate, but on ruins? What if all of it, the construction of new cities, the laying of roads, the creation of a rigid chain of command, was nothing less than building a new world on top of an old one that had been ordered, forgotten? In this view, Nicholas I is not just a conservative or the gendarme of Europe, but a titanic crisis manager who led a project to restore civilization across a vast territory while simultaneously erasing the memory of what came before. And Gogol was an indispensable part of this system. He was not a dissenter the regime accidentally overlooked. He was its most crucial tool in a highly sophisticated information operation. It's no coincidence that Nicholas I's great-grandson, Nicholas II, erected a monument to Gogol in Moscow in 1909. He wasn't paying tribute to a rebel, but to the man who helped his great-grandfather save and reformat the empire. Gogol accomplished his task brilliantly. He documented the new reality but made it palatable, stripping it of its horror and turning it into satire. His famous phrase about laughter visible to the world through tears invisible to the world takes on a completely different literal meaning. These were tears for a lost world that was ordered to be forgotten. Thus, the entire picture comes together. The catastrophe of the first half of the 19th century led to the depopulation of vast territories and a demographic abyss. To avoid collapse, Emperor Nicholas I initiated a project of total control and reality reformatting. Part of this project was the creation of a new historical memory, one where the catastrophe had no place. And the primary instrument in this process was the writer Nikolai Gogol, whose genius was channeled to use laughter to cover a gaping wound in the body of history. What we consider to be history today may very well be just a grand, masterfully written novel, commissioned by an emperor to hide a truth too terrible to remember.